first of all, I have to state that what I'm telling now is not my own idea, but it's the idea of Thomann, who brought me to this subject, and so she gave me the necessary start information for doing that. So in a way, I'm just acting as an assistant of her here, and so what I have to say is quite preliminary. The subject of the history of Persian medicine is not so well known than, for example, Arabic medicine. However, first I have a handout which will give you one document which I will refer to later in the talk. And now my contribution will consist of several parts. First, I thought it useful to give you a brush up of the history of Iranian languages, because it's a very mixed audience here. Then I will go on to talk about an early Persian source on Mercury medicines, an intermezzo, I would say, on production of mercury in Iran. Then I go on to say something about classical Persian works on medicine. And in the last part, I will focus on the treatment of syphilis in Persian sources. Now, Persian as a scientific language, to understand this, I have to go to antiquity to explain to make a brief history of Iranian languages. You see, in antiquity, the Iranian-speaking region formed a quite substantial part of Asia, and it reached far to the north into Central Asia and even Uralic regions in the south to the Persian Gulf and almost to Asia Minor. Now, in the course of time, Turkish tribes reduced this territory to an area which is today about what you see here. So it goes on, I mean, it still fills the southern part of the ancient territory, but has lost parts of Central Asia, which is now Turkish-speaking. And this process took place in the first millennium of our era, until, let's say, about the Mongolian time. Now, again, in late antiquity, the southern part of the Iranian-speaking territory formed a political unit under the Sasanian, it's the Sasanian Empire, and this was had its largest extent in the beginning of the 7th century, when even Egypt was under Sassanid rule. But soon after, the Sasanian Empire broke down by Arab expansion, and what you see here now is about the extension of the Abbasid Caliphate at its largest extension again. And you see the entire territory of the Sasanian Empire was now under Arabic rule. Now on the other side, the center of the Caliphate moved in the after the Abbasid revolution, moved from Damascus in Syria to Baghdad in Iraq, towards the east. And following this, Eastern culture became more important in the Islamic world. And in the 9th century, late 8th and 9th century, we see that renaissance of the sciences, also in the science of medicine, took place in Arabic language, and taking over many traditions from Iranian sources, and also from Far Eastern and Indian sources too, besides the famous translation from Greek. Now, in the 9th century, in the eastern part of the Islamic world, a kind of Iranian national movement occurred, and the eastern part of Iran and parts of Central Asia formed a new independent political unit under the dynasty of the Samanids. And this is now important for what will follow in my talk. Then we had a revival of Persian as a scientific language and as a language, as a national language for cultural purposes. And the Middle Persian tradition was survived only in the domain of Zoroastrian religious writing, and most of the secular books of Middle Persian were lost or were adapted into Arabic and survived only in Arabic language. But now, under the Samanid, especially in the 10th century, poetry in Persian was written down now in the Arabic writing system, and you know the famous book on the kings by Firdausi, and also lyrics was written again, and the famous tradition of Persian lyrics started in the 10th century, we can say, in the late 9th and 10th century. At the same time, prose works were produced in the 10th century in Persian, but in Arabic script, and there we find an early source on pharmacy, which contains a reference to mercury as a medicine. It is a pharmaceutical dictionary, the Kitab al-Adniya and Haqa'iq al-Adwiya, and written approximately between 964 to 975, and it's preserved in a unique manuscript from the 11th century in the Vienna library, and they produced a facsimile of this manuscript, as you see here. And now, in this dictionary, we find an entry for for mercury, which is called in Arabic zibak, in Persian rather zibak, which goes back to a Middle Persian expression. And you see a two-line entry in the dictionary saying that it is a useful mean against insects and things like that. Then it says that is against lice and their eggs, and with other drugs it is useful against scabies. And scabies mixed with birdwort, it's Aristolochia longa, I don't know this plant personally, and it's supposed to be useful against itching. So it's external use of, it seems. Now in another section, on aconite, the author Muwaffaq digresses on poisons in general and mentions several poisons, and says some of them are hot, they cause pain in the intestinal tract, accompanied by perspiration. And beside arsenic, some compositions, he mentions killed mercury, zibake kushte. And it is significant that Muwaffaq did not use the Arabic name zibak makdul, which we know from Arabic sources, but has really the Persian name of it. And this may imply that he knew this substance rather from a Persian tradition than from an Arabic tradition. However, no instruction for its preparation is given in this context. Now I come to an intermezzo, the production of mercury in Iran. I'm very grateful that Andreas Kaplon in Munich, who is preparing a book on trade in Central Asia, gave me some information on this, which I can use here now. So mercury was present in great quantity in Iran, and mines in East Takhar in the province Fars in southwest Iran produced it, in Bamiyan in Afghanistan, and in the Fergana Valley in Central Asia. Now, the last location is referred to also in one of the earliest geographical works in the Persian language, in the Hudud al-Alam, so there it is pointed to a mine where silver, gold, lead, copper were found, and also mercury. There can be no doubt, I think, that the mine is Haydar Khan, and I learned that this is the last a mine producing mercury for the world market, and except for mines in China which produce for the internal market. So there must be substantial resources left, and it's still producing mercury today. So with means which are not up-to-date technology, as I suppose. Now, the distribution of mercury seems to have been done with special drugs for mercury, and as is seen from an illustration of a Persian book, Ikhtiyarat Badi'i, and they are so-called spheroconical vessels, and they were mainly used for warfare, for fire grenades. And since in the collection of our institute we have an exemplar of it, I will give around this. It's a spheroconical vessel, maybe from the 13th, 14th century, so you can have a look at it. And so it seems that this kind of, let's say, you can touch it, and I just put it in a box in order that it doesn't roll from the table. And so it's documented that such similar vessels were used for mercury. And it is supposed that in close to Samarkand, in archaeological sites, some of these jugs were found with remains of mercury in it. But this is just an information I got orally. I don't have a hard evidence of that. Well, now I return back to literature. Classical Persian works on medicine were written mainly at the beginning of the 12th century, with the advent of the Seljuk dynasty, which brought Persian culture until up to Iraq and Asia Minor. And Ismail al-Jurjani was at the court of the Khwarezm Shah, one of the governors in Central Asia of the Seljuks. And he wrote the first thesaurus of medicine in the Persian language, the Dakhireye Khwarezm Shahi. And this was meant as a first real encyclopedia of all branches of medicine. It's preserved in many manuscripts in many libraries, but still there is no complete edition of the